toxic asset. That's what he said. My son, Nathan. He said it out loud in a room full of people in expensive suits. He wasn't looking at me when the words left his mouth, but it didn't matter. Everyone else was. On the massive screen behind him, a PowerPoint slide glowed with the title, Optimizing Expenses. And there was an arrow, a sharp, clinical red arrow, pointing to a line item that read, Legacy Pension and Healthcare Obligations. That was me. I was a legacy obligation. The room went silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that presses in on your ears. I could feel their eyes on me, a dozen pairs of them. I didn't need to look up to know what was in them. Pity from some, awkwardness from most, a kind of nervous relief from the ones who saw me only as a number on a balance sheet. And then Nathan, my son, cleared his throat. A small, polite cough, and he clicked the remote in his hand. The slide with the red arrow vanished, replaced by an architect's rendering of a new office lobby, all glass and steel and pale wood. He started talking about collaborative workspaces and brand synergy, his voice smooth and confident, as if he had just been discussing the rising cost of paperclips, not auctioning off his own mother's dignity. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I just sat there, very still, at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. I felt something inside me, something that had been warm and soft for 70 years, slowly begin to cool and harden. It was a physical sensation, like water turning to ice in my veins. They thought I was a liability, an outdated asset whose value had depreciated to zero. They had forgotten. They had forgotten that in the real world, the world of contracts and bylaws they claimed to master, some liabilities owned 51% of the company's shares. Nathan kept talking. He was passionate, animated. He used his hands, painting a picture in the air of this grand future he was building, a future built on efficiency, on shedding the past. He spoke of growth and innovation, and I realized he wasn't just talking about a building. He was talking about himself. This new office was a monument to his success, a testament to the man he believed he had become all by himself. I didn't look at him. Looking at him would have been a mistake. It would have let the mother in me surface, and the mother was of no use to me in that room. The mother was a liability. So instead, I let my gaze travel around the table. I conducted a silent audit of the souls in that room. My eyes fell first on Simon, the young chief financial officer Nathan had hired 6 months ago. He was sharp, hungry, with a haircut that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. He was the one who had made the slide. I knew it. He had the self-satisfied glow of a man who believes his brutal logic is a form of genius. As Nathan spoke, Simon nodded along, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second and gave me a thin, professional smile. It wasn't a smile of apology. It was a smile of justification. In his world of spreadsheets, I was an inefficiency, a problem to be solved. And he had just proposed the solution. Then there were the others. Mr. Davies, who was meticulously polishing his eyeglasses with a silk handkerchief, his eyes fixed on the task as if it were the most important job in the world. Miss Albright, staring down at her leather-bound notebook, her pen making small, meaningless circles in the margin. They were cowards. They wouldn't meet my gaze because doing so would require them to take a side, and their spines were as flexible as their stock options. Their silence was a vote for Nathan, a quiet, shameful endorsement. My gaze moved on, and it landed on Isaac Goldstein. He was the only one in the room, besides me, who had been there from the beginning. He remembered the day, 10 years ago, when this company was nothing but a pile of debt and a young man's desperate tears, my son's tears. Isaac remembered the day I walked into a much smaller, shabbier boardroom with a cashier's check in my hand, a check from the sale of my house. The house where I had raised Nathan, where his height was still marked in pencil on a doorframe. Isaac looked at me, and his eyes were not filled with pity. They were filled with a quiet, burning rage. a rage on my behalf. He wasn't looking at me as a legacy obligation. He was looking at me as the founder, the savior. He then turned his head and stared at Nathan with such profound disgust that for a moment I thought my son might actually feel it, but he didn't. He was too lost in the blueprints of his own legacy. Finally, my eyes found my granddaughter, Grace, Nathan's daughter. She was 19, a business student doing an internship. She was sitting in a chair against the wall, not at the table, just an observer. She was supposed to be learning, and she was. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. There were tears welling in her bright, young eyes, and she was trying desperately not to let them fall. She was looking at her father, and the adoration I had always seen in her expression was gone. In its place was a terrible, dawning horror, the horror of seeing your hero crumble into something small and ugly. Her pain was a mirror of my own, and it was the sharpest cut of all. I had my count: 1, architect of my demise; 2, maybe 3, willing accomplices in their cowardice; 1, loyal, furious ally; and 1, shattered witness who represented the future. It was more than enough. Nathan's voice continued to fill the room, a meaningless drone about quarterly projections and market penetration. And as he spoke, I let myself remember, not the good times, not his first steps or his graduation. I remembered the texture of the for sale sign on my lawn, the cold, metallic feel of it. I remembered the smell of cardboard boxes and dust motes dancing in the empty sunlit rooms of my home. I remembered the bank teller, a young woman with a kind face, who had looked at the amount on the check and said, "Wow, someone's having a good day." I hadn't replied. I just put the check in my purse, my knuckles white as I gripped the leather. It wasn't a good day. It was a necessary day. I remembered driving to Nathan's office. He was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. The air in the room was thick with the smell of failure and stale coffee. He looked up when I came in, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked like a little boy again. "It's over, Mom," he'd whispered. "I've lost everything." I didn't say anything. I just took the check out of my purse and laid it on the desk in front of him. He stared at it. Then he looked at me, his face a mess of confusion and dawning hope. "Mom, what is this? Where did you get this?" "I sold the house," I said. It was that simple. He started to cry then. Not quiet tears, but huge, shuddering sobs. He wrapped his arms around me and buried his face in my shoulder, just like he did when he was 5, and fell off his bike. "I'll pay you back," he choked out. "I swear, Mom, every penny, with interest. I'll make you proud." I had stroked his hair and said, "You don't have to pay me back. Just build something that lasts. Build something you're proud of." And he had. He had built this gleaming, profitable, heartless machine. And somewhere along the way, he had rewritten history. In his new version, the check from his mother wasn't a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It was seed capital, the sacrifice of my home. The repository of my entire life's memories had been reframed as a strategic, early-stage investment, and now that investment and the investor herself were being reclassified as a toxic asset. The ice in my veins was no longer just forming. It was a solid, unbreakable core. The mother who had stroked his hair was gone from this room. All that was left was the chairwoman of the board. And so, with this forward-thinking strategy, I'm confident we can increase shareholder value by 15% over the next 2 fiscal years, Nathan concluded. A triumphant smile on his face, he looked around the table, beaming, waiting for the applause. "Any questions?" The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was charged, electric. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nathan's smile faltered slightly. He looked around, confused by the lack of affirmation. Then a hand went up, slowly, deliberately. It was Isaac. He didn't look at Nathan. He looked directly at me, his old eyes clear and steady. The room held its breath. "I have a question," Isaac said, his voice calm and firm, cutting through the tension. "But it is not for the CEO." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Every single person in that room, including a stunned Nathan, turned to look at me. The power, which had been usurped, was now being handed back to me on a silver platter. Isaac continued, his gaze never leaving mine. "I have a question for the chairwoman of the board." I let the moment hang there. I picked up my glass of water. My hand was perfectly steady. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The small sound of the glass touching the mahogany table was like a gavel strike. The stone inside me wasn't a foundation anymore. It was a whetstone, and I had just sharpened my resolve on it. All doubt, all hesitation was gone. I knew exactly what I had to do. I placed the glass down gently. I looked at Isaac and gave him the slightest of nods, a silent, "Thank you." Then, for the first time since he had uttered those two words, I turned my head and looked at my son. I didn't see the little boy who scraped his knee. I didn't see the desperate young man with his head in his hands. I saw a stranger in a well-tailored suit who had just made a catastrophic business miscalculation. I leaned forward slightly and spoke, my voice not loud, but clear and cold enough to frost the glass. "Thank you, Isaac," I said. "I believe I do have a response. The board will now hear a new proposal. Its wall." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "The board will now hear a new proposal." For a moment, no one moved. It was as if I had pressed a pause button on the entire room. Nathan stared at me, his face a mask of confusion. The triumphant CEO from moments before was gone, replaced by a son who had just been publicly contradicted by his mother. His mind, I could see, was scrambling to categorize what was happening, and it was defaulting to the only context he had for me, family. He gave a short, forced laugh. "Mom," he said, the word dripping with condescension. "I appreciate your passion, but this is a board meeting. If you have concerns about the, legacy benefits, Simon and I would be happy to walk you through the numbers privately. There's no need to take up everyone's time with it now." He looked around the table, seeking support, offering the others an easy way out of the awkwardness. "This is just a family spat," his expression said. "Nothing to see here." Next to him, Simon, the CFO, gave a tight, knowing smirk. He thought he understood. The old lady was having an emotional moment. She was making a scene about her healthcare plan. It was predictable, pathetic even. He leaned back in his chair, ready to watch Nathan handle his sentimental mother. But before I could speak, Isaac's voice cut through the air like a blade. "No." It was just one word, but it landed with the force of a slammed door. Simon's smirk vanished. Nathan's head snapped toward Isaac. "The chairwoman of the board has the floor," Isaac said, his voice quiet but unyielding. He wasn't looking at Nathan. He was looking at the others, at Mr. Davies and Miss Albright, his gaze a silent command. "You will show respect." He had become my sergeant-at-arms, my second in this duel Nathan didn't even know he was fighting. I gave Isaac another small, grateful nod. Then, I pushed my chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the polished floor was unnaturally loud in the silent room. I rose to my feet. I am not a tall woman, but at that moment, standing at the head of the table, I felt as if I towered over all of them. All eyes were on me, Nathan's, full of irritation, Simon's, now laced with a flicker of uncertainty, Isaac's, steady and supportive, Grace's, wide with a kind of terrified hope. "Thank you, Isaac," I said, my voice perfectly level. The tremor I had feared simply wasn't there. There was only that cold, hard core of purpose. Nathan is right about one thing. This isn't a family discussion. This is a matter of corporate governance. I let my eyes sweep across the room, meeting the gaze of every board member. As the chairwoman, and as the holder of a 51% controlling stake in this company, I began. And at the mention of the percentage, I saw a new kind of awareness dawn on Simon's face. He was finally starting to do the math. I am invoking my right under Clause 12.4 of the corporate bylaws, which allows the chair to call an immediate, binding vote on any matter deemed critical to the future leadership and stability of the corporation. Silence. Deep, profound silence. Nathan's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked utterly lost. Clause 12.4? He probably hadn't read the bylaws since he signed them a decade ago. But I had. Oh, I had. I remembered the day they were drafted. My lawyer, a cautious old man named Abernathy, had insisted on that clause. Madeline, he'd said, his glasses perched on the end of his nose, love is wonderful and family is everything. But in business, a parachute is not a sign of distrust. It's a sign of wisdom. This clause is your parachute. I had thought he was being overly dramatic. I had trusted my son. But I had listened to Mr. Abernathy. And now, 10 years later, I was pulling the cord. What proposal? Nathan stammered, his bravado finally cracking. What are you talking about? I didn't answer him directly. I kept my address to the board, to the formal record. I am putting forth 2 motions for an immediate vote, I announced. My voice did not waver. Motion 1. The immediate removal of Nathan Price from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective as of this moment, for gross mismanagement and actions detrimental to the company's core values. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a soft, sibilant sound, like air leaking from a tire. Nathan stared at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. His face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. You can't be serious, he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. You can't do this. This is my company. Motion 2, I continued, ignoring him completely. The immediate appointment of Mr. Isaac Goldstein as interim chief executive officer to ensure a smooth transition and restore confidence in the company's leadership until such time as the board can convene a formal search for a permanent replacement. Isaac's face showed a brief flash of surprise, but he quickly composed himself, his expression settling into one of grim resolve. He understood. This wasn't a choice. It was a duty. Now the chaos erupted. This is insane, Nathan shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The water glasses jumped. This is a personal vendetta. She's upset about the expense report. You can't let her do this. He looked wildly around the table, appealing to the others. Simon, tell them. Simon looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding truck. His career, his ambitions, his meticulously crafted 5-year plan, he had hitched his wagon to Nathan, and he was now watching that wagon plunge off a cliff. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a numbers man, and the only number that mattered right now was 51. The bylaws are clear, Nathan, I said, my voice cutting through his tirade. There is no debate. We will proceed directly to the vote. All in favor of the first motion, the removal of Nathan Price as CEO, please say aye. I looked straight into my son's eyes. Aye, I said. My voice was the sound of a key turning in a lock. Then I looked at Isaac. He didn't hesitate. Aye, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. Now came the moment of truth. I turned my gaze to Mr. Davies and Miss Albright. They were trapped. They looked from my face to Nathan's furious one. They were calculating. On one side was the CEO they knew, the man who had been winning, the man who likely determined their bonuses. On the other was a quiet old woman who had just revealed herself to be the undisputed ruler of this kingdom, citing chapter and verse of the law. They could side with Nathan out of loyalty or fear and face the wrath of the majority shareholder, or they could side with me. It was a simple choice between a wounded lion and the owner of the zoo. Mr. Davies, the man who had been so diligently cleaning his glasses, cleared his throat. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at the polished surface of the table. Aye, he mumbled, the word barely audible. Miss Albright followed suit, her voice a faint whisper. Aye, The betrayal on Nathan's face was terrible to see. These were his people, his team, and they had just abandoned him without a second thought. All opposed? I asked, my voice formal. Simon finally found his voice. He had made his calculation. Siding with me now would be useless. His fate was tied to Nathan's. Nay, he said, his voice sharp with defiance. And the CEO? I asked, looking at my son, twisting the knife just a little. How does the CEO vote on the matter of his own removal? He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, speechless with rage and disbelief. He was no longer a CEO. He was just a boy whose favorite toy had been taken away. The motion carries, I declared into the stunned silence. 4-1. Nathan Price is hereby relieved of his duties as Chief Executive Officer. Security will escort you from the premises. It was a brutal, clinical dismissal, the way one might speak of a faulty piece of equipment being decommissioned. I didn't give them time to recover. We will now vote on the second motion, the appointment of Isaac Goldstein as interim CEO. All in favor? Aye, I said. Aye, Isaac said. This time, the ayes from Davies and Albright were slightly louder, more certain. They were aligning themselves with the new power structure. Nay, Simon spat, his face pale. The motion carries, I said again. Congratulations, Isaac. Please take the CEO's chair. It was done. The blitzkrieg was over. In the space of less than 5 minutes, the entire landscape of the company had been redrawn. Nathan stood there, frozen, his face a canvas of shock and fury. He looked at me, and the hatred in his eyes was so pure, so potent, it was almost a physical force. You did this, he seethed. After everything I built, you took it away. You didn't build this alone, Nathan, I said, my voice finally softening. Just a fraction. You built it on the foundations of a home you no longer remember. You thought that foundation was just a line item to be optimized. You were wrong. It was the thing holding everything up. I turned my head, and my gaze fell on Grace. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was looking at me, and in her eyes I saw not just the sorrow for her father's fall, but a dawning understanding. A flicker of the same steel I had just been forced to find in myself. She was seeing, for the first time, what true power and true liability really meant. And I knew that my parachute had not just saved me, it had saved the future of the company for her. The toxic asset had been removed. Now, the real work of rebuilding could begin. And tried it was. Nathan stood there, frozen for a heartbeat, the sentence I'd just spoken echoing in the silent room. You can't be serious, he whispered, the words ragged with disbelief. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, a ghost who had suddenly appeared at the head of his table. Then, the shock wore off, replaced by the familiar armor of his arrogance. He believed this was a negotiation, a moment of maternal hysteria that he, the calm, rational CEO, needed to manage. He forced a placating smile, the kind you give to a confused elder or a difficult child. Mom, he said, and the word was a deliberate jab, a reminder of our supposed roles. I understand you're upset. This is clearly an emotional topic. Perhaps we should take a recess. Simon and I can walk you through the projections, show you why this is a necessary step for the company's future. There's no need to. He was trying to dismiss me, to pat me on the head and send me back to my corner while the adults talked business. He was still playing by his rules, on his board, in his world. He hadn't yet understood that the world had fundamentally changed in the last 2 minutes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at him. Shouting would have been a sign of weakness, of emotion, and emotion, as he had just so helpfully pointed out, was something to be managed and dismissed. Instead, I turned my gaze to the far end of the table where a nervous young woman, the corporate secretary, was typing furiously, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard trying to capture the chaos. I spoke to her, my voice calm and clear, a perfect boardroom tone. Miss Davies, I said. She froze, Her fingers hovering over the keys, her eyes, wide with alarm, darted up to meet mine. Please ensure the official minutes reflect, I continued slowly, enunciating each word, that at 10:32 a.m., the chief executive officer attempted to interrupt the chairwoman of the board and unilaterally dismiss a formal proposal. The effect was instantaneous and profound. It was like throwing a bucket of ice water on the room. It was no longer a family argument. It was a corporate action, a matter of official record, a black mark. Nathan's jaw tightened. He knew what I had just done. I had taken his condescension and officially logged it as an act of insubordination. Simon, the CFO, flinched as if he'd been struck. His world of numbers and projections was governed by rules and procedures. I had just weaponized them against his boss. Now, I said, my tone unchanged, turning my attention back to the matter at hand. As I was saying before I was interrupted, the current agenda is no longer relevant. I reached for the beautifully printed agenda that was sitting in front of me. On the top, in elegant, sans serif font, it read, Q3 board meeting, a vision for the future. It listed Nathan's key topics: expense optimization analysis, presentation of the new campus project, shareholder value projections. It was his script for his coronation as a visionary leader. I picked up the heavy, expensive fountain pen that sat beside my notepad. It had been a gift from Nathan years ago. For signing big deals, Mom, he'd said. I uncapped it. The small click was the only sound in the room. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I drew a single, thick, black line through all of it. Expense optimization, gone. New campus project, gone. The ink bled slightly into the thick paper, a dark, final stain. This new office, this glass palace he wanted to build, was meant to be his legacy. But it was a legacy built on a lie, a monument to his own self-importance, financed by erasing my history, my sacrifice. He wanted to tear down the past to build his future. He didn't realize I was the past and the foundation, and he was standing on it. At the top of the now marred page, I wrote in large block capitals, pressing the nib of the pen so hard it almost tore the paper. 2 words: leadership evaluation. I laid the pen down. I, as chairwoman of this board, am officially amending the day's agenda. All previous items are struck. We have only one item of business before us today: a formal review of the performance, judgment, and fitness to lead of the company's current chief executive officer. The dam of Nathan's composure broke. You can't do that, he exploded, his voice cracking with rage. He was on his feet now, leaning across the table. That's not how this works. This is a flagrant abuse of power. It's not procedural. On the contrary, a calm voice said. It was Isaac. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his words commanded the room. He was the anchor in the storm I had created. Clause 8.2 of the bylaws gives the chair the explicit right to amend the agenda of any meeting, provided the amendment pertains to the immediate health and governance of the corporation. I would say a review of leadership falls squarely within that mandate. Nathan whirled on him. You stay out of this, Isaac. This is between me and my... He stopped himself, catching the word mother before it could escape. He knew, instinctively, that using it again would only prove my point. While Nathan was fuming, Simon was frantically scrambling. He had his copy of the corporate bylaws out of his leather briefcase, the pages bound in a thick blue binder. His fingers, usually so nimble on a calculator, were clumsy as they flipped through the pages. I could hear the whisper of the paper from across the room. He was looking for a loophole, a technicality, any sentence he could twist to his advantage. He was a man who lived by the letter of the law, and he was desperately trying to find a letter that could save him. But he wouldn't. I knew that document better than he did. Mr. Abernathy and I had spent a week going over every single word. I let them squirm for a moment. I watched the panic on Simon's face as he found nothing. I watched the impotent fury on my son's. I watched the nervous, shifting eyes of Mr. Davies and Miss Albright as they realized They were no longer here to rubber stamp a brilliant CEO's vision. They were here as jurors. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, into the silence, my voice laced with an icy calm. Nathan didn't seem to hear me. He was pacing now, behind his chair. 10 years, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. 10 years of growth. We're more profitable than ever. The stock is at an all-time high. And you want to talk about my fitness to lead? He turned to the board, his arms spread wide in appeal. "This is absurd. She's doing this because I proposed a necessary, if difficult, budget cut. It's an emotional reaction." "Is it?" I asked, my voice cutting through his tirade. I finally looked at him, really looked at him. "Let us evaluate that. Let's start the review right now." I picked up a piece of paper. It was the slide printout for his Optimizing Expenses presentation, the one with the red arrow. "You presented this slide, did you not, Mr. Price?" I used his formal name, and I saw him flinch. "You stood before this board and referred to a human being, a co-founder and the majority shareholder, no less, as a toxic asset and a legacy obligation to be eliminated." I paused. "Tell me, in your esteemed business judgment, is that the action of a fit and stable leader? Or is it the action of an arrogant boy who has forgotten the difference between a balance sheet and a family, between a liability and a lifeline?" He had no answer. His face was pale. The words, repeated back to him in the cold, sterile environment of the boardroom, sounded as ugly as they truly were. "You wanted to discuss optimization," I continued, my voice relentless. "Very well. Let us discuss it. You proposed cutting my health benefits to save the company, what, a few $1,000s a year? A rounding error on the budget for this new palace you want to build. A palace you plan to finance by selling off parts of the company's soul. That was your grand vision." I let my gaze travel around the table. "My proposal for optimization is different. I propose we cut a liability that is arrogant, that is ungrateful, and that has just proven to this entire room that his ego is a far greater risk to this company's future than any pension plan." I leaned forward. "The agenda stands. We will now begin the evaluation of the CEO." I looked at Nathan, my son, who stood there trembling, stripped of his power, his plan in tatters. "Do you have anything to say in your defense? If you won, do you have anything to say in your defense?" The question hung in the air, cold and sharp. This wasn't a mother asking her son to explain himself. This was the head of a tribunal demanding an accounting. Nathan stared at me, his face a maelstrom of emotions, rage, disbelief, but underneath it all, a flicker of something else, fear. He had been so confident, so wrapped in the narrative of his own success, that the idea of being held accountable, truly accountable, had never crossed his mind. He wasn't the CEO anymore, facing a disgruntled board member. He was a defendant in a trial he didn't know had started. He tried to rally. He drew himself up, pulling the tatters of his authority around him like a worn-out cloak. "My defense," he scoffed, trying to inject bravado into his voice. "My defense is the balance sheet. My defense is a decade of unprecedented growth. Look at the stock price. Look at our market share. I took this company from the brink of bankruptcy and turned it into a powerhouse. That is my defense." He looked around the table, desperately trying to rally the jurors. Are we really going to let a personal grievance, an emotional overreaction to a single line in a presentation, derail everything we've built? I let him finish. I let the silence stretch after his words, letting his self-congratulatory speech hang in the air like cheap perfume. "Thank you, Mr. Price," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "You wish to be judged on your record? Excellent. I couldn't agree more. Let's examine that record." I didn't need notes. The numbers were burned into my memory. I had spent the last 2 months, ever since Nathan had first started floating the idea of this monstrously expensive new office, doing my homework. I had been worried then. Today, I was armed. "You speak of growth," I began, my tone turning crisp and analytical. "And it's true. Revenue is up. But at what cost? Let's talk about the numbers you don't put on your triumphant presentations to shareholders." I looked directly at Simon, the CFO. Mr. Davies, correct me if I'm wrong. Over the last fiscal year, while our revenue increased by 12%, our executive and client entertainment budget increased by 43%. Did it not? Simon blanched. It was a direct hit. He knew the number was correct. He had signed off on the expense reports, the private jets for client meetings that could have been video calls, the $1,000 dinners, the corporate box at the stadium. I didn't wait for his answer. And while we were spending a fortune to impress people, our capital expenditure on upgrading the factory floor machinery, the very heart of our production, was deferred. Again, for the third year in a row, a budget reduction of 15% this year alone. I turned my gaze to Isaac. Isaac, you've been on the factory floor. What are the supervisors telling you? Isaac leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. They're telling me the machines are breaking down, Madeline. They're telling me we're losing days to maintenance that should have been done years ago. They're telling me our people are working with outdated equipment while they read about the company posting record profits. Morale is at an all-time low. Thank you, Isaac, I said. Then I turned back to Nathan. So, you have defended the balance sheet, but your balance sheet is a story of vanity. You've been polishing the brass on a sinking ship. You want to spend $80 million on a new headquarters, a monument to your own ego while the engine room floods. Is this the unprecedented growth you're so proud of? Or is it gross, catastrophic mismanagement? He was speechless. I had taken his greatest weapon, his numbers, and turned it against him. He had no defense against the facts. He tried to pivot. Image is important, he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. We need to look successful, to be successful. The new campus is an investment in our brand, in attracting top talent. And what talent will we attract, Nathan? I countered, my voice sharp. The kind that values a fancy lobby over the stability of the company they work for? The kind that is happy to see the company's founders treated as disposable assets? And there it was, the heart of the matter. I picked up the remote for the projector. The screen behind Nathan still glowed with the slide for the new office rendering, his utopia. I clicked a button, and the image changed. I went back to the slide. The one titled Optimizing Expenses. The one with the red arrow pointing at my life, my sacrifice, my worth. It loomed over him, a public indictment. But this, I said, my voice dropping, all the false boardroom formality gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity, is not just about mismanagement. It's about character. It's about a failure of leadership so profound it represents a direct and immediate threat to the stability of this corporation. I stood up, my hands resting on the table. A leader does not see his own history as a liability. A leader does not see the people who built the company alongside him as line items to be cut. A leader does not, in a public forum, refer to his own mother, the woman who sold her home to save his dream, as a toxic asset. My voice, for the first time, trembled with a carefully controlled fury. That is not a business decision. It is a sickness of the soul. It is a rot at the core of this company's leadership. And like any rot, it must be cut out before it spreads. I let my words sink in. The room was deathly quiet. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to have stopped. Mr. Davies and Miss Albright were staring down at the table, refusing to look at anyone. Simon looked defeated, a soldier whose general had just been exposed as a fool. Grace was watching me, her eyes filled with a terrible, painful awe. And Nathan, my son, he just looked broken. The armor was gone. The bravado had evaporated. All that was left was the hollowed-out man he had become, staring at the wreckage of his own making. Therefore, I said, my voice returning to its formal, unwavering tone, I am calling the question. The agenda item before us is the evaluation of the CEO. My evaluation is complete. My conclusion is that he is unfit to lead. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member in turn. I hereby motion for the immediate removal of Nathan Price from the position of Chief Executive Officer. As the holder of 51% of the voting shares, I vote aye. My vote landed on the table like a block of granite. There was no taking it back. I then turned to my left. Mr. Goldstein? Isaac didn't hesitate for a second. His voice was firm. For the health and future of this company, I vote aye. 2 votes. We didn't legally need any more, but this was about more than legality. It was about a mandate. It was about cleansing the room. I looked at Miss Albright. Her face was pale. She looked at Nathan, a flicker of old loyalty in her eyes. Then she looked at me, at the undeniable power I now wielded. She chose survival. Ah, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned to Mr. Davies. He adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and nodded. Aye. 4 votes. A clean sweep. Simon knew it was pointless, but he held his ground. Nay, he said. A final, futile act of defiance. I looked at Nathan. Mr. Price? I asked. A final formality. He didn't answer. He just shook his head slowly, a look of utter devastation on his face. The motion carries, I declared. 4-1, with 1 abstention. Nathan Price is removed as CEO, effective immediately. It was over. I picked up the remote control one last time. I pointed it at the projector, at the hateful slide that was still burning on the screen behind my son. I pressed the power button. The bright light died. The screen went black. Nathan's era was over. The monument he had built to himself had crumbled to dust, and in the sudden, blessed darkness, I could finally begin to see a future. The black screen was a void, a period at the end of a long and painful sentence. The room was utterly still, the air thick with the aftershock of the vote. Nathan stood beside his chair, which was no longer his. He wasn't yelling anymore. The fight had gone out of him, leaving behind a hollow, stunned emptiness. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the CEO fell away completely, and I saw my son, lost and wounded. It was a look that would have shattered my heart an hour ago. Now, it only strengthened my resolve. This was a necessary amputation. Painful, yes, but vital for survival. He slowly began to gather his things, a leather portfolio, a pen, his phone. His hands trembled slightly. Each small movement seemed like a monumental effort. No one spoke. No one offered to help. Mr. Davies and Miss Albright were staring intently at their notebooks, as if they contained the secrets of the universe. Simon, the architect of my son's downfall, sat, frozen, his face the color of ash. He had hitched his wagon to a falling star, and now he was in freefall. I let the silence hold for a moment longer, allowing the finality of what had happened to settle into the bones of the room. Then I spoke. Thank you, I said, my voice steady and clear, addressing the board. Thank you for your trust. What happened here today was not easy, but it was necessary. Now the work begins. I remained standing at my place at the head of the table. The CEO's chair, the one Nathan had just vacated, sat empty. It was a throne, and it was tempting, but I knew better than to sit in it. My power wasn't in a title. It was in the foundation of the company itself. As of this moment, I announced, to ensure stability and a seamless transition, I will be assuming the duties of interim chief executive officer alongside my role as chairwoman. Mr. Goldstein will assist me as chief operating officer. His first task will be to conduct a full, transparent audit of the last 2 years of executive spending. At this, Simon's head snapped up. Panic flared in his eyes. I met his gaze and held it. We need to understand exactly where our priorities have been, I said, the message clear. The days of rubber-stamping vanity projects were over. My first executive order is effective immediately, I continued, my voice gaining strength. The proposed $80 million new campus project is canceled, permanently. I saw a wave of relief wash over Isaac's face. All funds allocated for that project, and any funds recovered from Mr. Goldstein's audit of unnecessary executive expenditures will be immediately reappropriated. Our new priority number 1 is a complete overhaul and modernization of our production facilities. Isaac, I want a full proposal on my desk by Monday morning. Spare no expense. We are investing in the heart of this company, not in a glass box to impress Wall Street. I paused, then added, furthermore, a portion of those funds will be allocated to a 10% bonus for every employee on the factory floor, retroactive to the beginning of this quarter. They are the ones who create the value. It's time they shared in it. This was it. This was the antidote to the poison. We weren't just cutting a toxic leader. We were actively healing the wounds his leadership had caused. Nathan had finished gathering his things. He stood there for a moment, looking at the empty chair, then at me. His face was a closed door. I couldn't read the emotions behind it anymore. He turned without a word and walked toward the exit. As he passed Simon, he didn't even look at him. He was a general, abandoning his last soldier on the battlefield. The door to the boardroom clicked shut behind him, a quiet, final sound. In the wake of his departure, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by a nervous, uncertain energy. It was then that Simon, the pragmatist, the survivor, made his move. He cleared his throat. "Madam Chairwoman," he began, his voice slick with a newfound deference, "those are bold, decisive actions, truly visionary. Redirecting capital to core infrastructure is a brilliant strategic pivot. I fully support it. My department will, of course, offer Mr. Goldstein our complete cooperation in his audit." It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to save his own skin. He thought I was like Nathan, susceptible to flattery. He was wrong. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. "Thank you for your support, Mr. Davies," I said, deliberately using the wrong name. "I'm sure your cooperation will be thorough." The dismissal was absolute. He shrank back in his chair, knowing he was on borrowed time. My gaze then fell upon the corner of the room where my granddaughter, Grace, was still sitting. She hadn't moved throughout the entire ordeal. She had been a silent witness to her father's destruction. Her face was tear-streaked, but her eyes were dry now. They were fixed on me, and in them I saw not just shock, but a glimmer of fierce, burgeoning strength. She had seen the ugliness of power misused, and she had just seen it reclaimed. "Which brings me to my final point," I said, my voice softening for the first time. "The future. It is not enough to fix the present. We must build a stronger foundation for the years to come." I looked directly at Grace. This company was built on a principle of legacy, not the kind you list on a balance sheet, but the kind you pass down through hands that care. We lost sight of that. Today, we reclaim it. I am creating a new position effective immediately, assistant to the chairwoman. It will be a training role, a mentorship. This person will be my eyes and my ears throughout this company. They will learn every facet of this business, from the factory floor to the balance sheet. They will learn it from the ground up, the right way. I let my words hang in the air for a beat. I am appointing Grace Price to this position. If the room was shocked before, it was stunned now. Grace's mouth fell open. She looked from me to the board members and back again, her eyes wide. "She's a student," Simon protested weakly, a last gasp of his old authority. "She has no experience." "She has more experience than you think," I said, my voice sharp. "She has spent the last hour learning the most valuable business lesson there is, the difference between price and value. And she has a quality that has been sorely lacking in our leadership recently: integrity. Her training starts today." I looked back at Grace. "Well?" I asked gently. "Do you accept?" She stood up, her movements a little shaky but resolute. She walked from her observer's chair in the corner to the main table. She didn't look at anyone else. She walked straight to me. She stood before me, a young woman on the precipice of her entire life. "I won't let you down, Grandma," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion but firm. "I know you won't," I replied, and for the first time, I allowed myself a small smile. It was then that Isaac stood up and walked over. He ignored my outstretched hand and instead pulled me into a brief, firm hug. "It's good to have you back, Madeline," he said, his voice gruff. Then he turned to Grace and smiled warmly. "Welcome to the real business school." The meeting was over. Davies and Albright and a ghost-white Simon filed out, mumbling their congratulations. Soon, it was just the three of us in the vast, silent room. Me, Isaac, and Grace. The old guard and the new beginning. I looked at the empty CEO's chair, then at Grace. "That chair," I said, "is not a prize. It's a responsibility. One day, you'll be ready for it. But you'll earn it, not with ambition, but with wisdom. Not by forgetting where you came from, but by honoring it." I felt a surge of energy I hadn't felt in a decade. The weight of years of passive observation had lifted. I wasn't just a shareholder anymore. I wasn't just a mother or a grandmother. I was the chairwoman. I had a company to run, a legacy to restore, a future to build. I had not just taken back control, I had taken back my purpose. And different. 3 years, it's a short time to rebuild a soul, but a long time in the life of a company. The boardroom, once my battlefield, was now a place of quiet confidence. The heavy, polished mahogany table remained, but the atmosphere around it had changed. The air, I often thought, smelled of coffee and optimism now, not fear and expensive cologne. On my desk, in the office of the chairwoman, sunlight streamed through the window, falling across a small, silver-framed photograph. It was taken last year, at the company picnic. In it, Isaac, his face crinkled with laughter, had his arm around Grace. I stood between them, a genuine smile on my face, the kind that reaches your eyes. For a long time, another photo had sat in that spot, a studio portrait of a young, smiling Nathan, full of promise. I hadn't thrown it away. I had simply put it in a drawer. It was a part of my history, but it was no longer my present. This new picture, this chosen family, was my present. Today was the annual shareholders meeting. It was held in a larger auditorium now to accommodate our growth. The room was packed. I sat on the stage, with Isaac to my right and Grace to my left. She was no longer the silent intern in the corner. She was the chief operating officer, and she had just finished presenting the quarterly results. She spoke with a quiet confidence that filled the large room. She didn't have her father's slick showmanship, and thank God for that. She had something far more valuable: authority. She knew her numbers cold, but she also knew the names of the supervisors on the factory floor. When she spoke of modernizing a production line, she spoke of the people who worked on it, of making their jobs safer and more efficient. She spoke of the company not as a machine for generating profit, but as a living organism, an ecosystem where every part had to be healthy for the whole to thrive. The shareholders, a mix of old-timers and new investors, listened with rapt attention. They trusted her. In 3 short years, she had earned that trust through relentless hard work, transparent communication, and an integrity that shone from her like a beacon. I hadn't just groomed an executive, I had nurtured a leader. When she finished her presentation, the applause was long and genuine. She smiled, a brief, warm flash, and then looked to me. It was my turn, the final item on the agenda. I walked to the podium, the same one where, 3 years ago, my son had effectively tried to erase me. I looked out at the sea of faces, and I felt not a single tremor of anxiety. I felt only a profound sense of peace. My work was done. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and steady. 3 years ago, this company faced a crisis of leadership, a crisis of identity. We had become focused on the appearance of success, and in doing so, we nearly rotted from the inside out. We were reminded, in the harshest of ways, that a company's true foundation isn't its stock price or its brand image, it is its values. I paused, letting the words settle. We chose to reinvest in our foundation, in our people, in our products, in our integrity. The results, which Miss Price has so ably presented, speak for themselves. We are stronger, healthier, and more profitable than ever before, not in spite of our values, but because of them. I did not embark on that rebuilding effort alone, I continued, turning to look at Isaac. I had the counsel and unwavering support of a man who has been the conscience of this company for over a decade, and I had the energy, the vision, and the hard work of a young woman who has proven to be one of the finest business minds I have ever had the privilege of mentoring. I turned back to the audience. A leader's final and most important job is to know when to step aside, to ensure the future is in hands even more capable than their own. For me, that time is now. A murmur went through the crowd. Effective at the close of this meeting, I will be retiring as chairwoman of the board. I held up a hand to quiet the rising buzz. This is not a sad day. It is a triumphant one. It is the final step in securing this company's bright future. The board has already met and voted unanimously on my recommendations for my successors. I am proud to announce that our new chairman will be Mr. Isaac Goldstein. Isaac stood, and the room erupted in a standing ovation. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound, humble gratitude. He deserved this more than anyone. And, I said, my voice swelling with a pride so deep it almost ached, it is my greatest honor to recommend, and for the board to have confirmed, that the new chief executive officer of this company will be Miss Grace Price. The second wave of applause was a tidal wave. It washed over the stage, a roar of approval and excitement. Grace stood, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fierce determination. I nodded at her. You are ready. The rest of the meeting was a blur of formalities, handshakes, and congratulations. I stepped back, letting Grace become the center of gravity. She handled it beautifully, speaking with investors, shaking hands with employees, her new authority settling on her shoulders like a perfectly tailored coat. That evening, I was at home, sitting on my porch, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, a habit, it seemed, I would never break. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was still. I felt a quiet, settled contentment I hadn't known was possible. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me. I picked it up, a text message from an unsaved number, but I knew who it was. The words were few, stripped of all emotion, but they were there. Heard the news. Congrats to Grace. She earned it. That was all. It wasn't an apology. We were long past the point where an apology would mean anything. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was something quieter, something colder, a fact, a surrender, a recognition from one business person to another that the best player had won. And in its own strange, sterile way, it was the closest to respect he had ever shown me. I didn't reply. I just put the phone down and looked back at the sunset. The chapter was finally, truly closed. The next day, I went into the office one last time to clear out my personal effects. There wasn't much. A few books, a pen set, and the photograph of me, Isaac, and Grace. As I was leaving, I walked past the CEO's office. The door was open. Grace was inside, standing by the large window, looking out over the city. She wasn't admiring the view. She was surveying her territory, her responsibility. She heard me and turned. "Grandma," she said, a smile lighting up her face. "You're leaving?" "I am," I said, staying by the door. "It's your office now, your company." "It will always be the company you saved," she said quietly. Twice, I smiled. "Just build something that lasts, Grace. Build something you're proud of." She nodded, understanding the weight of those words, the history they carried. I turned and walked down the long, quiet hallway, my footsteps echoing softly. I didn't look back. There was no need. Everything I cared about was in safe hands. As I walked out of the building and into the bright morning sun, I thought of his words, the ones that had started it all, the ones that had turned my heart to stone and, in doing so, given me the strength to act. Toxic asset. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps that's what I had become to his reckless ambition. But sometimes, in a body overcome with sickness, a toxin is the only thing that can trigger the violent, necessary purge. Sometimes, the poison is the cure. The company was healthy now, and so was I.